This is going to be a fairly brief lecture about the Vietnam War. However, I have provided you additional sources that I want you to review. Those sources will help you get a deeper understanding of the Vietnam War, in particular, the events that led up to the Vietnam War. Your objectives are to understand what events led to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War mobilization, what life was like in Vietnam during the war, and Americans' views of the Vietnam War. The events that led to the Vietnam War. In 1945, the Japanese had occupied Vietnam, surrendered to China in the north, and Britain in the south. A man by the name of Ho Chi Minh took control of northern Vietnam. He was a member of the Nationalist Party, so referred to as the Viet Minh, and he was also communist. He wanted Vietnam to become communist. France tried to restore their control over Vietnam. France had had a history with Vietnam dating back to the late 1800s when the French colonialists controlled Vietnam. They were known to be a very oppressive regime towards the Vietnamese people. At the end of World War I, France will also try to control Vietnam. And the U.S. supported France's efforts to restore their control over Vietnam. Both the U.S. and Great Britain will provide financial help because the U.S. and Great Britain were allies of France. And they also did not want Vietnam to become communist. Ho Chi Minh, who was seeking Vietnam's independence from France, went to the U.S. for support, from which Truman, who was president at the time, rejected. In 1954, the French efforts failed, and it will end with what was referred to as the Geneva Accords. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, and it also called for a free election in 2 years to unite Vietnam. However, the U.S., then President Eisenhower, rejected the accords and took power in South Vietnam. And this is what it looked like at the Geneva Accords. A man by the name of Diem, it's spelled D-I-E-M, but it's pronounced Diem, who was Catholic and anti-communist, became the premier of South Vietnam through elections, which was not an altogether free election. But nonetheless, the U.S. Helped to install Diem in South Vietnam. The U.S. felt if an anti-communist was in the South, then that would prevent the spread of communism all throughout Vietnam. And it turned out that Diem was oppressive to the Vietnamese people, but the U.S. had to continue to back him because of their fear of the spread of communism. Remember, our policy was containment to stop the spread of communism. So they were afraid that if Vietnam became communist, so would Laos, so would Cambodia, and so forth. So this is how they justified supporting a oppressive regime. John F. Kennedy will inherit it's the commitment by the U.S. to the Vietnamese. In fact, he will increase aid and will send the Green Berets to train the South Vietnamese Army. But you will have a group called the National Liberation Front Guerrilla Forces, so referred to as the Viet Cong, that will rebel against them. JFK will put it out there that he might be supportive of a military leader that might want to take over in South Vietnam to rebel against the National Liberation Front guerrilla forces. So, what this ends up looking like is that the U.S. is trying to perform a coup in Vietnam. Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, inherited the Vietnam War when he became president after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. During Johnson's administration, the Vietnam War will escalate. In particular, it will escalate because of the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. What had happened was the North Vietnamese had attacked some of the U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. It ended up not being a major attack. One, I think they found maybe a single bullet hole, and then in the other, it was just some misread of radar sightings. But nonetheless, this caused Johnson to go to Congress to take measures to move against the North Vietnamese. And ultimately, Congress will honor that request and give him authorization. Now, they don't declare war, but they do appropriate money and give him the authorization to move against the North Vietnamese, which was referred to as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Vietnam War will never actually be declared. It will always be what was referred to as a police action, very similar to what the U.S. had done in Korea. The mobilization of the Vietnam War is a bit different than the mobilization in World War I and World War II. The mobilization in Vietnam really consisted of appropriation of funding and then uh, authorization of sending the military to Vietnam. Both the military that was standing at the time as well as additional draft and volunteers. In 1966, there were 388,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. In 1967, there was 485,000. In 1968, it rose to 543,000. And the U.S. will have a very large defense spending budget to fight the North Vietnamese. With respect to life in Vietnam, it was very tough on both the Vietnamese as well as the soldiers that were fighting there. I'm going to provide you a couple of film clips that really gives you some perspective of both of what the Vietnamese were experiencing and what the U.S. soldiers were experiencing, and what soldiers in general uh, were experiencing. So I will put those links up on Canvas. So please review those. Many Americans' views of the Vietnam will change throughout the course of the war. In the beginning, the the U.S. government presented this war as a necessary war, necessary to fight the spread of communism, and also necessary to defend an oppressed people. But throughout the course of the war, many people will really get a different image of that war. One of the reasons is because of the television. One thing that's different with the Vietnam War than World War I and World War II was that images of the war were being shown on television. It's one thing to read about soldiers being killed, and it's something else to actually see them being killed on your television set. So every night, people would see images of villages being burned, deaths of Vietnamese, deaths of women, deaths of children, deaths of U.S. soldiers, deaths of Vietnamese soldiers, executions, you name it. So many people are going to really get a negative view of the Vietnam War. Many felt that the U.S. should not be in Vietnam, that there were just too many people being killed. Others felt that the U.S. had no chance of winning the war. Others felt that the war is not the U.S.'s business, that this war had been a war of independence from France, and then it became a civil war, and that the U.S. really had no reason to be there. Another issue was the amount of money that the government was spending on the war, money that many felt could be spent on education or poverty. But there were still others who did believe in the war, that the U.S. should be in Vietnam, that they should be there to defend and oppress people, to stop the spread of communism. And then one of the views was that the U.S. can't lose a war. The U.S. had never lost a war. And how would that look to the American people? And how would that look to the world? If the U.S. lost a war, then we would look weak. So those were the views. And those who opposed the war were protesting that war. They were burning draft cards. They were marching in Washington. Some of these protesters were part of what was called the counterculture. And the counterculture was a group of primarily young people, college-age people, who rejected their parents' culture, who rejected a lot of the norms from the 1950s. They grew their hair long. They listened to what they called hippie music. And they were also very opposed to the Vietnam War. So the end of the war comes in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. This is an image of the fall of Saigon. This is the last helicopter going out of Saigon and people trying to get on that helicopter, people trying to escape the soon-to-be communist regime. The war ends with the administration of Nixon. So this war really covers a number of different presidents, starting with Truman, going through Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Johnson, and then finally Nixon. This ends your Vietnam War lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know.